Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Wild Hearts at Work podcast. I am your host, Melissa Boggs, and we are here with another episode. In this episode, my good friend Mike Berman has joined me. Hello, Mike. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Melissa. Thank you so much. It's a big pleasure and an honor to be here today.
Yay! All right. So, Mike, can you start by just telling people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've been kind of working in product development for the last 10 years or so. I've been in a bunch of different roles. I've been a CEO of my own little startup, working with like one other friend. I've worked inside of startups that had really rapid growth. I've been in big companies, and I've been in all sorts of different kinds of roles: Scrum Master, product owner, business analyst, product manager. So I've kind of been through a lot of different areas. But yeah, I kind of have really found that I love product ownership and how I can serve people in that way and serve our customers.
And that's how we know each other. So let's just jump right into that. So you and I met for the very first time at a Scrum Alliance hiring event. Oh gosh, I couldn't even say how long now, probably 2 years ago or maybe more. So I want to start there a little bit. I know there's a little bit of a story behind why you even attended the hiring event. You mind sharing that?
Yeah, it was kind of wild. I had been in a number of different companies, and I just wasn't seeing the potential of what I thought working in an agile or Scrum environment could be. And I was kind of a little bit just tired of looking and tired of searching, and decided, if this is what work is going to look like, I think I'm going to go do my own thing. I actually planned on becoming a stock market investor, and had a friend that said, you really got to come check out this interview. It's going to be really fun. Even if you don't want to work here, you got to try this interview because it's really unique. And that was my experience coming in. Was I'm just here for the interview to see what's going on. And it was the most amazing interview I've ever done. So, part of this interview, I remember there were multiple other product owner candidates, and I had to refine a backlog with other product owners at the same time. And that might sound like really like kind of scary and intense, but after all that was done, like we all went to lunch together and we shared our phone numbers and our LinkedIn. We're like, let's all support each other. This is really great. Came back and we had this, lean coffee where we were just talking about what we know. And it was just really an amazing way of connecting with all the different people and hearing a lot of truth that I hadn't really experienced in an interview, right? Most people are trying to sell things to you rather than saying, here's what's really going on. And it was really clear that at the end of the interview, that I'm like, this was what I've been looking for. This is what I've been trying to find for so long and didn't think existed anymore. And there it was.
Amazing. So it was a little bit of my wild heart shining through in the design of those events. And I plan to, at some future date, have an episode where I literally just talk about the hiring event. So I won't go too deep into those, but I will say that, what you experienced was exactly what we were going for. We were going for creating an experience where someone creative, innovative, energetic found themselves belonging rather than, trying to like fit, into some corporate, boring 6 interview long process where, halfway through it, you're like, I've told my life story 4 times already. So I'm glad that that's the experience that you had. What that tells me, my friend, is that you may be a little bit of a wild heart yourself.
Yes. Yeah. I was just thinking that nothing drives me more crazy than doing things because that's the way they're done, right? Following the status quo. And it's just reminding me of a conversation I had a long time ago. I was working with a team of people, and they were working 50 plus hours. They're all tired. They're all grumpy and annoyed at each other. And we had all sorts of bugs in our product. And I went to management. I said, this is got to stop. Like, we can't have these guys working as long as they are. They're tired, right? I can point you to the data that says this is too long. Like, they need some time off. They need to be, cut their hours short, make them go home. And I remember them saying, I agree with you, but we got to get our product out. So we're going to do it anyway. I'm like, but the product is slow because of this problem.
Right. It's like a chicken and the egg, like, but it's not, because it's
Yeah.
clear what the root cause is here.
Yeah.
So
And
what happened in that story?
they continued to burn themselves out, and it was exhausting. And I worked there for about a year, and I just said, I can't do this anymore. It's the only time in my entire life that my blood pressure was high. I put on weight. I was like, this is actually literally killing me to be doing this. And we were doing great work, but it was really tough. And we actually had a big kind of come to term with this attitude kind of thing when the bugs got so bad that we actually had to shut down our services for a month and a half just to fix them. Like, it shut down the company. And it was like, and I'm sitting there going, I knew this was going to happen. Like, how could it not when you treat people like this?
Yeah, consequences.
Yeah.
People always talk about results, and those are probably the results you don't want. Man, that's rough. So I want to ask you, so we've established you're a wild heart. I'm going to overuse this phrase, by the way. Like, I think by episode, 15, I'm going to actually have to stop saying it in every episode. But I am curious if you would be able to define it. Like, what does it mean when you say, yes, I am? How do you relate to that?
Well, it's funny because I spent the last about week and a half or so reading Find Your Why by Simon Sinek. And I've been really trying to discover what my why is and identify with that. And I actually found that kind of the golden thread there of my history and my life has really been about pushing boundaries and finding that on the other side of that is greater fulfillment and meaning. So, any opportunity that I have, it doesn't matter what the situation is, I'm like, but what's really possible? Like, where could we really go with this? And finding that almost always, right, that these boundaries that I think exist for myself or for my team or the people I'm working with aren't real. And there's always something a lot more powerful on the other side of that.
I think that's what's like the last part that you just said is so important, because I think often people like ourselves are viewed as just almost like rebellious for no reason, right? Oh, you're just, rejecting the status quo because, where I think many of us who see the world that way, it's because we see something else on the other side. Like, I think that's what's so important about what you said. It's not for the sake of like being a pain in the ass. It's because there is something on the other side that is even better, that is even, more valuable or worth pushing for. So yeah, I love the way that you phrase that. Curious, often when we see, when we are something, we see others that are like us. How do you spot those other people like you? How do you spot the creatives, the innovators in an organization? Can you spot them? Do you spot them right away, and how?
So I think first is speaking authentically. Putting yourself out there first is kind of the best way to kind of open up that door to let other people say their own truth. And that was a big part of why I wanted to find my why, so that I could speak to it and actually say, like, really put myself out there and say, this is who I am. What do you believe? I think as well, I don't actually know anybody who isn't at some level creative and passionate. I've met people in a bunch of different workplaces, like, I just want to do my job, like, just tell me what to do kind of thing. But then when they're given the opportunity to really think and move towards something that they're passionate and excited about, they just start bursting with all sorts of ideas. And, again, it's like, I think they hold back because they don't believe it's possible that they can live into those values and those ideas. So it's the responsibility of the people around them, people like me, to make sure that they can do that.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. I've had other guests say something similar, that like we all have, like Doug Harrison, my very first episode, said, it's like everyone I know has that in them. So it makes you think about, like, there maybe are just some of us who have had the opportunity to be supported in that more frequently, and therefore we seek it out. And like you said, now we have a responsibility to sort of, reach a hand out and like help other people feel supported in the same way. I actually think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I talk a lot as a product owner. I've done a few short talks, and I like to joke that product owners are dumb. And I mean that in the sense that, like, as an individual, I can't possibly think of everything. I don't have all the perspectives or the ideas to really make great products. So for me, my self-interest is like, I actually really want and need everyone on my team to really be energized and thinking about what we can do and coming up with ideas. And yeah, when I'm working with a great group of people, I'm almost never the one that has the right idea. It's always the people around me.
So I'm sure that's true, but I also know you've had some great ideas, and you just gave me a perfect segue. So I know that there are some things that you have done and sort of introduced to teams in the past. Are there any of those that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so it was really interesting because when we worked together, we went on to an unlimited PTO plan. And it was really funny because my team immediately panicked because we were like, we're all workaholics. We never want to leave. What are we going to do? We're never going to take a vacation again. Just tell us to take vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent a lot of time actually thinking about, well, what's the most appropriate way to take vacation, and started looking at a lot of research that other people have done around time off, and kind of came up with a plan or a baseline to start with, and said, let's try this and let's see if it works, and we'll track it. And actually found that for every 8 weeks that we worked, we should take a week off. And that was actually came from a study, and we found, by tracking our own data, that was pretty close to what actually worked best for us. And for Americans, that's a lot of vacation. And it was really surprising to look at something like that and deal with that discomfort of, this idea that you have to work hard, and working hard means working long hours, and say, well, actually, our creativity and our focus and our happiness, it all starts to drop around week 6 or 7. We actually need to take that time to actually be more effective at what we do.
Absolutely. And the results are there. Same thing, right? The positive results are there. Yeah, I certainly remember that. I also remember something that you're very passionate about that we didn't quite get to in our organization together, but I think it's very cool. That's somewhat related. And I know you know what I'm talking about.
Yep, I do. It was one of the more frightening moments because we used to host these user groups inside of our building. And there was one day where I was talking at one of these user groups, and I had been to a lot of user groups before this, but this was the first time that I was working with you in our organization. And I said, if you really want to be bold as an organization, you need to let people sleep at work, right? And this was a really crazy statement. But I'm like, I read this book, Why We Sleep. Our pattern of staying awake all day long, it's not natural. Again, it's one of those things that's kind of counterintuitive and so against the grain of our cultural norms to do something like that. But it's has all these benefits. It does make you more productive, more creative. And I kind of threw out there, it's like, NASA does this, and so does Mercedes-Benz. So why not you, right? And I'm literally standing there talking about all this stuff. I'm like, but we don't do this. And I'm telling people in my own organization in public, kind of this challenge, let's rise up to this challenge kind of thing to do it.
And clearly I never forgot it because it
Yep.
comes up every time we talk. Because I think it's brave to even bring it up. And I think it would be very brave if, we were to hear about more organizations doing it. I actually think that the pandemic, with all of the not good things that have happened, it has sort of started to unravel some of that. So, in a previous episode, The Great Reckoning, I was talking about how it broke open just this idea that you have to be sitting at your desk from 8 to 5, and that's the only way that you're productive, and you have to be in person and whatnot. We got a lot more understanding of human needs because the pandemic forced us to. And not just because we're working from home, but because people had families and people had their own sick relatives that they were taking care of. And so we were like, okay, we're going to be really understanding and really flexible. And surprise, work still got done, you
Yeah.
know? And so I don't know, maybe napping at work is not as far off as it was maybe 2 years ago, right?
Maybe not. I don't know many people that talk about it. I will talk about it. I took a nap today.
Hey.
Yeah.
So another thing we talked about a lot at Scrum Alliance is our values, right? We talked day in and day out about the Scrum values and how important those were to us as an organization. And I know that's something that you care a lot about. So I'm curious if one, you can share, if it's not too personal, what your core values are, and then how you see them in action in your life.
Yeah. I've actually been working a lot on trying to define my own core values. I do really love Brene Brown's Braving. There's a lot of value in that, and I've been kind of incorporating some additional parts to that. And yeah, in part of the discovery of trying to define my own values, I've actually seen some of the impacts that I didn't realize this was the trigger for some of those challenges in my past. And they were actually really meaningful. And I was thinking about it in a specific way, like a specific scenario of how values need to show up. And one of the things I like to say is values should be verbs. And there's a reason for that. So one of the two really common values, and we shared these values when we worked together, but I think a lot of organizations have these values, are courage and respect. And I was thinking about a scenario where one person says, I have a lot of authority and I know what I'm talking about, just do what I say, right? It's going to work out in the end. And someone else may be thinking, I don't like what you're saying. It makes me uncomfortable. This doesn't seem right. So the question then is, for that person that doesn't feel comfortable with that, how do you live into your values, right? And if courage is your value, then the question becomes, well, how do you define courage, right? Because if courage is, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to speak out right now, that's one way to handle it. Courage could also be, I'm going to have the courage to be humble. I'm going to listen. Maybe I'll learn something. This person clearly has authority. It could be that courage is, I'm going to persevere, right? This isn't my time to pick this fight, but I'm going to keep holding on to this. I'll let this slide, but I'm going to keep holding on to this. On the other side of that is respect, right? And you may have different ways of defining respect. Respect might be, I respect authority. This person said, do it, I'm going to do it. That's what respect is. It could be that I respect this person. I'm not going to call them out because there's other people around. I'm going to wait until I can have a private conversation, right? Or it could be that, hey, I respect this person. I know that they want to grow. I know that they're tough. I can throw anything at them. They'll understand. They're going to learn from what I'm doing here, right? So part of the challenge with all of these different ways of interpreting it is, like, number one, you have to kind of define, well, how do you live into these values in that moment? And that can be really difficult. There's all sorts of different permutations there of those two, and they're conflicting. And then you also have to take into account, well, how does this person that's talking about just do what I tell you, how do they define courage and respect? Because if they're not in alignment, you're going to have a challenge or a problem there. Something that I borrowed from Lenny Noyles is something that if you don't know him, he's a fantastic coach that lives around the Denver area, and I talk to him all the time. And something he said that has stuck with me and I keep referring back to is, holding people to expectations that they didn't agree to isn't fair.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this is kind of one of those places that's really hard to identify, right? That you may have an assumption about how, oh, this is how I define courage. This must be how they define it. But if they don't define it the same way, it's going to come off as unfair. And it's going to be a really big challenge. So I said that this had like a really big personal impact on me, because for me, I define courage as, I'm going to be that one that's going to stand up and I'm going to say, this doesn't feel right. I don't like it. I need to say something right now. At the same time, I have this idea of respect of, like, you're strong. You'll take this. You'll grow from it. This is valuable to you. Right. So I'm living into my values when I say something like that. And I learned, I did this with my own boss at the time and close friend. And then I did this with another person on my team that I was, we were kind of having some challenges, and I saw some challenges and said, I need to speak up on them. And instead of the person responding the way I hoped they would, of, thank you for bringing that to my attention. Thank you for your honesty. Let's figure this out. Let's grow together. They said, you're mean. I don't like the way you're talking to me. I don't want to work with you anymore. Which was devastating, right? And for a long time, I couldn't understand that. Like, I couldn't even say that I'm sorry because I was living into my values. I didn't understand what had happened. And it wasn't until later that I went, it's because they didn't have that same expectation of how I should act in that situation. And so it didn't feel okay to them.
Yeah. And that's tough. It's so tough because when you have that clash of values, like we don't, like you, like we don't always see it immediately. So you can't always even talk about it. Like you're feeling, and especially, I'm a huge believer of living into your values. I think that's incredibly important. But you can become very rooted in that and like concrete and less flexible in that moment because you are clinging so tightly to these values. And you're like, but I'm living out my values. So I've certainly experienced that too. And I think it probably is especially challenging when your definition even bounces through each of the three that you just, shared. Like sometimes I feel like courage is, stepping up and saying the thing. Sometimes I feel like it's, taking someone aside. And what I feel like I'm doing is, responding to the moment in the situation. And that's a good thing. But it also means that people don't always know what to expect from me because my definition has a spectrum. Maybe it's not that it changes, it's just that it has a spectrum. And so I think this is where it's so important that we have conversations about this, that we talk about it, in our teams or with our boss or whatever it is.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I think that conversation is really the very important part of that. And again, it's really about setting those expectations of like, how are you expected to respond to something? And I think equally, right, you're going to have times where you just don't align, and being able to recognize that and also set the expectation that that's a place to have a conversation is really important. Because like in those scenarios that I just talked about, right, the response was, let's just shut this down, right? We're going to not talk anymore, when both of us were, had cared quite a bit about each other before that. So this was an opportunity where I wish that expectation had set, like, hang on, neither of us are trying to hurt each other. What's going on? How are we off on our alignment?
Yeah, for sure. I literally see that with my children. And luckily you can be outside of it with your kids and you can say, hey, like, intention and impact are different here. Impact is what matters. However, let's recognize intention and have a conversation. So, I really love that. I love the work that you're doing in terms of like the internal work. It's just so important not only to do it, but to talk about it and to normalize doing that kind of work. Yeah. Okay. I want to shift gears a tiny bit. I want to ask you if you could speak to some of your past or future leaders. If you were like in a conference room and they were sort of all in the room and you could talk about what it's like to be, I don't want to just say a wild heart because again, I don't want to overuse this phrase, but someone who's so brimming with like creativity and innovation, what did you hope that they would notice about you? How did you hope that they would identify that in you?
That's a really interesting question. It's making me think of something I just wrote down not that long ago, an idea that came into my head. And it was that bad leaders limit potential. Great leaders help people see the potential they didn't even know they had. And I think that's something that really stands out to me, is wanting a leader that understands that, that I'm there with ideas, that I have ideas, that I want to bring things forward, that I want to try things, and basically, not just ask permission to like, let me go do that, but, have that support to continue and drive for that. I think that's really what I look for in a leader.
Excellent. So let's flip that question. You've led, your startup, and I have to imagine more to come. How are you going to check yourself to make sure that you're identifying that in people that are working with you?
Yeah, I mean, part of all that internal work is for that reason. It's so much about, identifying my why, identifying my values, to make sure that there's a stable foundation, so that the very first people I talk to, even if they're just kind of helping me out, can really understand like where I'm coming from and some of the expectations that I have, and be able to build on that. And then I think there's just a level of humbleness, to be able to say like, look, I have a very narrow perspective. I have some things I'm very good at, some things that I'm not. And I invite other ideas. Like, I need those other ideas for the success of the people that we're trying to do and the mission that we're trying to accomplish.
Amazing. Have you found yourself in the presence of leaders like that, where you felt super comfortable, super safe, and able to do your best work?
Yep. Yes. A few. Melissa, not to make you blush, you're one of them.
Oh, I was not leading in that direction, but okay.
You fell into that trap. No, I've met a few. It's sad how rare it is, and I think it's a sad thing to say that I haven't met a lot of leaders that are like that, especially leaders or hierarchical leaders rather than leaders in the sense of helping other people. And it's part of why I've gone on to do my startup, because I'm just not seeing it created in the world. That said, I'm thinking of the CEO that I had when I first graduated college. And one of the things he said to me that I just loved, he loved to reference this story about a guy who made a huge mistake, and it cost the company $100,000. And he was really scared to come to his boss and admit to his mistake. But he comes in and he says, I just made this huge mistake. I'm sorry I cost you all this money. Are you going to fire me? And his boss looks at him and goes, why would I fire you? I just spent $100,000 on your training.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's so good.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also thinking of, my best friend. He runs a gym for kids in Boulder. And I've talked to him, and, he talks about like, he's done every single job he's ever asked anybody to do. Like, he knows so much about what's going on, and he's willing to do anything that he asks anybody else to do, and willing to support them any way he can. And his employees are like family. I mean, they're so close. He talks about like, anytime he asks for time off or needs help on something, like his employees just jump and say like, I can help. Like, I want to help,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a relationship that is formed when people feel safe. And that's regardless of like the hierarchy, whether they're a leader, quote unquote, or, whatnot. I mean, when you can create that kind of safety, there's a relationship. And with that relationship comes, going back to it again, creativity, innovation. We talk about this all the time with companies. We talk about the importance of innovation. What we don't talk about is the relationships. We talk about it like it's a process. We talk about it like it's a thing that you plug in, when at the end of the day, actually, it's about like a network of relationships that create the space to do that work. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, trust is just so fundamental to any of this stuff working well.
Yeah, absolutely. Trust, safety, and kind of like the consistency of it all is probably the most important, because you can have like an example I've been using a lot lately. If you have a hackathon, but you only have it once a year and there's nothing else that supports it, then 364 days of the year you have nothing. Then all that hackathon is going to do is highlight the fact that you don't have any sort of innovation for 364 days a year. And so that's where the relationships, the network, the trust, all of it comes in, on a more consistent basis.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Another question. How would your first boss, and whatever that might have been, like could be, babysitting, could be the grocery store, how would your first boss have described you?
Interesting. So the first boss I had, I was working behind the counter at a local like sandwich shop. And I remember at the end of the year, he said, I was 14 years old, and he said, you got to find another job. You're too good for working here.
Oh,
And I was like, but I love working here, and I love to eat the food that I make here.
right. I can imagine you though coming in and like being like analyzing the like the lineup of the meats and cheeses and like figuring out the most efficient way to get them across. All right. So what's the description though? Like what would he have said about Mike?
I think he would have talked about kind of some of that enthusiasm that I had to bring to the job, and some of these very different perspectives. I remember the whole reason I had a job is that I was trying to pay for a ski racing camp, and so I had like a tip jar with like a story of like why you should, bring tips in and that kind of thing, and it increased their tips like 3 or 4 times the amount just by having some of those tips in there. But yeah, just I was reliable. I really cared about what we were doing. I really loved to engage with people coming in, and I worked there because I loved the food. So I think that passion was there. It was like, yeah, I'm making great food, and come share in this great food, everybody.
I love that. So I have to imagine all of the things that you just described don't just apply to work. Do you see some of those qualities? I know this is like uncomfortable at making you say nice things about yourself, but I think it's important. Do you see those qualities reflected in your hobbies and in your family life, or, things outside of work?
Yeah. So part of this why discovery that we did involves hours of talking about stories about yourself and the other person listening, and trying to understand themes and bringing those to your attention. And then you go and talk to your best friends and you ask them, why do you like me? Which is like the most awkward conversation ever.
Oh, I love it though.
Right. And you're not allowed to let them off the hook either. So when they're trying to, they're stumbling, trying to answer, you just got to let them keep going. And it was really amazing the things that they would say at the end of that, because they talked about, this connection that they had with me that they didn't get from other places, or how when no matter what's happened in my life, that I keep finding a way to push and find new ways of doing things and continuing forward. And yeah, I mean, Melissa, that I've had like this very long athletic history. I trained to be a U.S. Olympic skier when I was a kid, and then had some really awful things happen in my life that kind of broke that down, and was left in a place where I was about as low as you could get, where I just didn't have much of a future ahead of me. I didn't think I was going to finish college or have a full-time job, and certainly never thought I'd be an athlete in the future. But I just kept plugging away, like, how can I improve this situation? What really are my limits? Where can I go with this? And I ended up, spending 10 years doing parkour, and was good enough to be in commercials where I made money doing parkour. I got into climbing mountains, and now I've climbed mountains all over the world. And Kilimanjaro, I've climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. I've climbed a bunch of mountains in Mexico. I've climbed like all the biggest mountains in the Rockies. Now I'm really into downhill mountain biking, and I jump my bike over really big jumps and things like that. Right. And all of that has to do with like, what's really possible for me? How far could I really go with this? And that's part of why I'm doing this startup. Like, it's scary and I'm really unsure of it, but I'm like, but could I? Like, what is my limit here? Like, how far could I take this? I want to know.
I love it. I know I don't know, maybe it doesn't make you uncomfortable because the find your why is giving you some practice. But part of the reason I always ask people these types of questions on the podcast is I do think that sometimes people who are challenging, or people who are, looking for new ways of doing things, can be seen as obstacles. And I really want the leaders who are listening, or ourselves who are, future leaders, to recognize how much opportunity there is in these people, and that these people inherently, it's not that some of the stuff can't be learned, but either you inherently have it or you've been supported enough to develop it in your career. And it doesn't just stop with work. It's a creative energy. It's an enthusiasm. It's everything that you just said, that exists in your employees, probably, like you said, all of them. But, the ones who are especially vocal might be the ones easy to think, oh, why can't they just do their job? Because they can't. They can't
Right.
just do their job. They can't not want to make things better. And especially the ones that are really focused on people. They can't not want to make things better for other people in the organization. Like, it's part of their DNA. And we are much better off when we lift those people up and we see the opportunity.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier what kind of leader I look for. And as you were saying that, I was thinking of the late Tony Tsai, right? And he talks about how some leaders try to be the greenest plant in the greenhouse, and everyone should try and emulate them and grow to be them. And he's the kind of leader that thinks of himself as the greenhouse itself. He's there to help all the other plants grow. And that's the kind of leader that I think we need. And I mean, again, in my experience, the people I work with, they're all passionate at some level. They're all smart. They all are capable. You just need to find kind of the right ways to let them, spread their wings and do what they want to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to hurt any of the leaders listening who feel like they're being attacked by me right now. That's not at all my intention. I actually think that historically we haven't necessarily taught leaders to look for that. Like there's probably sort of a societal, generational, cultural gap that exists where, we need to unlearn and relearn how to look for those opportunities and remember that people are people, they're not resources, and that they have something to offer beyond just what we expected. And that should be exciting, right? Like you hire someone based on a job description and you get more than you asked for. That should be awesome. Like that should be expected, that should be exciting that it's beyond what you expected. But it can be a little scary when you don't know what to do with it because you haven't been taught.
Yeah. I think a lot of the challenge that we see is people coming out of school and, they've learned through many, many years how to answer questions. And something that I really appreciate is something that Elon Musk talks a lot about, right? He talks a lot about how the first thing he wants to teach people when they come out of school is not how to answer questions, it's how to ask the right questions, right? And really pushing for that. And I think something else that you said kind of made me think of this too. It's like this idea that business as usual, like, kind of the status quo, like this actually isn't usual. We haven't had a lot of these business practices for that long. You go back 100 years and everything was completely different. And, so we're still very much experimenting with these business models. And I think they're free game to continue to modify and change and develop.
Oh, I love that so much. I absolutely agree. And I love it so much. All right. I want to ask you a little bit about this journey that you've been on with Find Your Why. Was there anything, I know you're still on it to a certain degree, but are there things that have stood out that just floored you, whether it was about the process itself in the book or your own journey and what you're taking away from it?
Yeah. So I think there's two things. Number one was how important it really is to me. Once I really understood where the why lives, right? It lives in part of the limbic system of the brain, right? The emotional center where we make a lot of our decisions, right? And it's a space that doesn't have language in our brain and is actually very, very difficult to put words to. But understanding like that's really the core of our humanity. That's how people, our customers, our employees, that's how they relate to us. And being able to understand that is critical to how we show up in the world. So that's one. The other was that I was completely on a different level of what my why was going into it. I really thought, looking back, that, it's got to have something to do with leadership or empowerment. And then through that why discovery, I discovered that it was actually something much deeper that was driving me. And it kind of put all the pieces together. And a lot of things that I've done or made choices about in my life before doing that discovery suddenly made sense in that context that never made sense before. And that wasn't just my experience. I did this with my now new manager at my new job. And he had the same exact experience. He's like, I didn't realize it was this deep.
Wow. I kind of, what came up for me when you were describing it, when you were talking about everything clicking, like I literally imagined sort of standing in front of an open door and taking a huge deep breath of fresh air. Like, oh my goodness, there it is. And like the door's open now because I can breathe and I see things clearly, and now I can kind of walk out into the world. So for whatever that's worth, that's kind of how it hit me. That was my visualization of it.
Yeah, it feels like that. It feels like I have a new sense of focus and a new way of, identifying what's really important and how to move forward. I remember being really scared too, going into this. I was like, what if I find out that my why is a completely different direction I've been going with my life, and I'm going to have to quit my job and change everything to follow it? Fortunately, that wasn't the case, but
I feel like that's happened to people though. Like you see, you hear these stories of people taking like a 90-degree turn with their life, and it generally, while scary, ends up exactly where they should have been because they kind of got to the bottom of what made them tick. So I love that you're on this journey. We may have to talk down the road when you're kind of, I don't know if you're ever completely finished, but when you're toward the end, about how that is playing out for you. So as we're starting to wrap up, are there any final thoughts or anything you wanted to share with people, or a way for people to get in contact with you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I kind of already shared my why. I'll share it, again with you, right? My why is to push boundaries of what we believe is possible so that we can find greater fulfillment and meaning. And I've started my own business, as we've kind of referenced a couple of times. It's called Human Business Culture. There is not much on the website yet, but I am in that process right now of identifying value propositions and different ways of approaching things. And one of the things I really want to focus on right now is finding the leaders out there who are creating these new businesses, the future places to work, and helping them build human-based cultures right from the very beginning, and making sure that they can protect that as it goes down the road. So if that's something that you're interested in or want to learn more about or just talk to me about, please reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn as Michael Berman, or you can email me at mberman@humanbusinessculture.com.
It's so exciting. You have an official email.
Yes.
I've been privileged to be, in the cheering squad on the sidelines of this venture. So I'm really excited for what this is going to mean for you and what it's going to mean for the world. So for those of you listening, thank you again for joining us for this episode of Wild Hearts at Work. This has been my dear friend, Mike Berman, and I appreciate you being on the podcast. I appreciate your vulnerability and all the work that you're doing. So thank you for sharing your story with us, Mike.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for all the listeners out there that paid attention to me.
So if you're listening and you love it, please like, share, subscribe. I also now have a Patreon if you'd like to support the podcast. There are 4 different tiers, includes exclusive merchandise and also monthly newsletter. There's all kinds of stuff on there. So feel free to check out the Patreon. But most of all, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your support. And until next time, dear hearts, stay wild.